So good evening, everyone. My name is Anita Verna-Crofts, and I'm the Associate Director at the Communication Leadership Graduate Program at the University of Washington, and we are so happy that you're all joining us tonight. On behalf of ComLead, I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth presentation of our Student COVID Consultancy Speaker Series, and our topic tonight, I'm so excited about this, is nonverbal communication in the time of COVID. A few announcements before I formally introduce my colleague and tonight's special guest, Dr. Valerie Manusov, who is in my upper left. Don't know exactly where she falls for you. Good, she's highlighted herself by giving a nice little chuckle. But before I introduce Valerie officially, a couple announcements. The first is that we are recording tonight's session and conversation. The second is that if you have the bandwidth, we'd love for folks to run their video. It's great to see who's on the call, but we certainly understand if it's easier to keep just your name on the screen, but we do invite folks to share their video screen if so inclined. It's because it's great to be able to welcome you and know that you're here. The third announcement, as folks know who have been on these kinds of speaker calls before, is that you are always welcome at any time during the presentation to enter a question for Valerie during the live Q&A that we'll have after her presentation. So we will be reading those questions to Valerie in that portion of the evening. So at any time that you're inclined, drop a question into the chat box, and Mo Herbert, who is our Zoom DJ for this evening, will pose those questions during that part of the program. And then fourth, before my introduction of Valerie, I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn, who is going to screen a very short promotional video about the work of this student-focused COVID consultancy.
Does the COVID-19 pandemic have you or your organization struggling to connect? The University of Washington's Communication Leadership Program is here to help. We have assembled our COVID-19 Consultancy to help nonprofits, small businesses, and on-campus departments. We can help you communicate within your organization and with your audience, pivot communication strategies in the face of COVID-19, create videos and other multimedia assets, and host online events. As community builders and communication professionals with expertise in digital technology, our graduate students and alumni are uniquely equipped for this moment. We're offering pro bono consulting, events, and professional connections. Whether you're a business owner, an employee, or simply looking to improve your communication strategies, we're here to help you. For more information and to schedule a consultation, visit bit.ly/UWCOVIDHelp.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. So now, we are so lucky to be sharing the screen tonight with Valerie Manusov, esteemed professor at the UW Department of Communication. And in addition to being an expert in the field of interpersonal and nonverbal communication, I'm here to tell you that Valerie is also one of the most personable and thoughtful people you will ever meet. I've had the pleasure over the last decade to watch the way Valerie engages with the world. She's attentive, she's deeply sensitive to those around her, and she builds people up. She makes you feel really good about yourself, and she does this with colleagues and with students alike. I've been the recipient of that building up, and I just want to tell you, Valerie, how much I have appreciated it over the years. I'm also particularly excited tonight because Valerie has been a champion of ComLead for as long as I've known her. And I believe, though, that this is and she's confirmed with me beforehand, that this is the first event where the extended ComLead community has audience with her. And I can't think of anyone better to help us consider nonverbal communication in the time of COVID. So Valerie, let's begin. And for those who are familiar with the speaker series, this will be familiar to you as I take us through it, but I'll share with those that are new tonight, the way that these hour pluses unfold is that the stage, or the screen rather, will be turned over to Valerie. She'll give us a presentation. I'll then follow with some questions after Valerie presents. Then we'll open it up to the live Q&A for all of you that Mo Herbert will facilitate via the chat box. So again, drop your questions in anytime. And then at the end, Valerie will close with a call to action. And then I've got a couple announcements followed by what I like to imagine is that after a talk, when you approach the podium and just have a couple words to say to the speaker, we'll turn off the camera, we'll turn off the recording, but we'll have a couple minutes after those announcements where folks can greet Valerie, can thank her. And so we encourage folks to stay behind for that as well. So without any more further ado, I'm going to cede the screen to you, Valerie, to take us into this conversation. And again, we're so grateful that you're joining us, and so grateful for all of you that are taking time out of your evenings, wherever you are in the world right now, to spend it with us here at this program. So Valerie, how about it?
Thank you so much, Anita. And everything you just said about me, I would have said exactly that about you as well. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm going to put my slides up in just a moment, but I kind of wanted to give you just a bit of a sense of how I'm orienting this discussion today. So even though there was a little bit in the sort of the blurb about this around tips of what to notice during this time, what I was just saying to the crew before was that I think that at this particular moment, people are more aware of nonverbal communication than they often are, because so many things are changing. So I'm looking at this as an opportunity to be able to help us see those a little bit better and to use them, but really focusing on a couple of different environments. And one is the Zoom environment like this, and how nonverbal cues are showing up there, and some of the challenges and some of the benefits of this kind of technology. And then also what it's like to be in the world out there when we are masked or not. So I'm sort of going to focus on those two things, but with my hope is really to talk about the nature of nonverbal communication so we understand it better. When I teach this class, and what I hope to do today too, is to give you a little bit of a deeper sense of this as a really complicated and important form of communication. We have a lot of misnomers about it, sort of false beliefs about how it works, and I think that those things get us into some trouble. So that's sort of where I'm going with the presentation. So I will go ahead and share the screen. Okay. So this is me and nonverbal communication in the time of COVID-19. And I think that this image is going to be something that the moment that we see it, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we'll know exactly what this moment is. So there's a symbol, a nonverbal symbol that's a part of this particular moment. It's not up. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, if you hover.
Sorry about that. I am not the most technologically expert person. I think most of you are much more so than me. So I want to start just briefly with a definition of nonverbal communication for a couple of different reasons. One is that a lot of people will use the term body language, and for a number of reasons I find that problematic. But a big part of that is because it doesn't take into account all of the many, many different kinds of cues and behaviors that actually are part of the meaning that we make in our interactions with others, when we're watching television, when we are deciding who to vote for. All of those, there's so many different kinds of things that can potentially be meaningful. So I define it just very broadly as all those cues that can communicate in addition to language. Some people will talk about besides the words, but one of the things is that nonverbal communication, just like I'm using now, is oftentimes done at the same time as language, but it can also sort of stand on its own. So it includes things like proximity, or how far we stand from someone, touch, facial expression, eye behavior, body movement and position, the environment that we're in. So one of the interesting things about this moment, for example, is we see each other in our home environments. Normally when we're interacting with someone, we have a shared space, but this gives us new information about the person. And there's been really some interesting things that have been talking about what backgrounds people choose. So whether you're like Evelyn and choose this amazingly beautiful UW background, or a lot of people choose bookcases as a way to enhance credibility. This just happens to be what's behind me, but if it works, I'll take that too. But the environment is playing out in some different kinds of ways now. Our use of time, how many things we do at once and how quickly we do things, how much time we spend with people. Vocal cues, which are anything about the voice, including saying things like our appearance and and as well as objects that we have. And I think I meant to write objects at the end instead of touch, so that should be objects. So you can see that there's many, many different kinds of cues that are all potentially vehicles for communicating with others. So just a couple of foundational issues. One of the things that people often believe about nonverbal communication is that it's a universal language. That is, it's something that everybody does throughout the world in the same way. And while there are some things that we do have that are part of our biological, physiological system that makes us do certain kinds of things similarly, there's actually very little that remains completely universal. That is, there's so many cultural rules, ways that we learn to do things, that thinking of it as a universal system is one of the things that sometimes gets people in trouble, because we see somebody else communicating in a certain kind of way, and we assume that they share the same meanings that we do, or the same rules for their use. So I oftentimes argue that while there are some universal characteristics to it, it's not a universal language that can be understood by all. It would be great if it could be, and we can certainly do some basic things to communicate if we don't have language, share language with someone else. But in general, it's useful to think of it as, I oftentimes call it cultured, that is really steeped in our own cultural rules and norms and values and beliefs. And in doing that, it's easier for us then to not make assumptions about what somebody else meant. We absolutely are a product of our biology, and that is, we do a lot of things, even why, for example, touch, when it's wanted touch, feels so good. It's because it's tied to particular hormones that get released when we are touched or touch somebody else. So we do a lot of the things that we do because of our biology. But again, all of that is strongly shaped by the larger culture in which we use that behavior. So we have a biological and evolutionary basis for our nonverbal behaviors for many of the capacities that we have, but it's not something that's only tied to our biology. Another thing I think is really important is that not only are there all of those different kinds of cues that we have available to us, but the behaviors themselves hold meaning in different kinds of ways. And one scholar kind of came up with these three ways of describing them. We talk about symptoms, semblances, and symbols. And symptoms are those cues that actually extend directly from our biology. So if you are feeling tired, you might yawn. If you are not feeling well, your skin may change color. If you're in a bad mood, you might sort of slump in your chair. All of those things happen as a direct result of something that you're experiencing. Oftentimes we think about that nonverbal communication is just that, these sort of windows to the soul that we don't really have any control over. But those actually make up very few of the behaviors that we use in interactions with other people. The other two are a little bit different. I make the argument that semblances are actually one of the things that we do the most. Semblances are those cues that have a tie to our biological origin, but are used in social kinds of ways. And so they're not a direct tie. So if you see somebody and you smile at them, a smile may arise naturally when you're happy, but it also is being used very, not consciously necessarily, but sort of automatically to show sort of that you see somebody else there, to kind of greet them in some way. So the smile has a tie to a biological origin, but we're not actually experiencing that biological thing in that moment. Instead, we're using it in a rule-governed social kind of way. So even something like the yawn, if you, and I often will joke with my students about this, if you want to let the teacher know that they need to keep moving on, you might yawn purposely, even if you're not really experiencing that. So many of our cues are used specifically because we are in social interactions, and they're a version of something we might have done naturally, but they wouldn't have arisen just from the natural capacity. They're arising from the needs of the social interaction. The symbols are sort of the most communicative one. Symbols are any behavior or something like an object or a wall, a face mask at the moment, that might have some pragmatic purpose, but the meaning that we have for it is fully given by a culture. So a face mask doesn't mean something necessarily unless we have some larger kind of cultural understanding for it. So there are many things. Some of them are gestures, like if I do the V sign, it means a number of different things, and it means things in different cultures, but it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. It means something only because we've culturally agreed that that's what it's going to mean, in a similar way to language. So it's important to understand those, because it means that how we think of the behavior, if we think of it as a symptom or a semblance or a symbol, we're going to interpret the behavior in different kinds of ways. But it's important to understand that we have all of those available to us. One of the things I think is particularly important, though, as I mentioned before, is that our use and interpretations of nonverbal cues is embedded in our cultural learning, including rules for their use. And one of the things that we see changing at the moment is what those rules are and what those rules mean. So it used to be, for example, like these two fellows, if they're strangers, there's a cultural rule, if you have a large bench like the one that they're on, to sort of sit in farther places. If someone came and sat right next to you and you didn't know them, they'd be violating the rules. At the moment, though, we're all distancing in a new kind of way. So our proxemic behavior is changing. So the rules are to some degree changing as well. A couple of you had questions about things like people who greet by kissing on the cheek, or someone else I know who really doesn't like handshaking and really hopes that after this time of COVID, that some of those rules will stay more like they are now than how they were before, which is absolutely possible. But perhaps the most important thing that I stress always about nonverbal communication and ties to these issues that I was just talking about is that every cue or set of cues can be interpreted in more than one way. That there's a concept called polysemy, and polysemy means that a particular word or a particular gesture or a particular action can be interpreted in multiple different kinds of ways. And that's a really important aspect of this, is that you don't necessarily know what someone is communicating or means to communicate through their behavior. And you're not going to be absolutely sure that your particular interpretation is right. And so typically I urge people to be open to and mindful of what are some of the other interpretations, especially when we have a negative reaction to somebody else and we assume that they were doing something that we might think is really problematic. Then if we understand that that might not have been the meaning, that there may have been a very different legitimate meaning for the same behavior that we're just not thinking about, it sort of opens us up to be able to communicate, I think, a little bit more compassionately. So as I mentioned, these rules and interpretations change over time. What we do and how we think about them and how we value them are very different now than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They're also going to be different, as I mentioned, across cultures. So there's a dynamicness to the ways in which we both use nonverbal cues and the meanings that we give to them. So the first context that I want to talk about is online nonverbal communication. A number of us, when we're on Zoom, we think we look like the Brady Bunch, so I thought I would bring those in here. And so for the younger folks in the group, now when you hear people talking about the Brady Bunch, you know what it is. So this was in their opening of their TV show. So one change at present is the greater reliance on Zoom and other line meeting platforms. One of the things about this is it limits the use of certain cues. So for right now, you have sort of this part of me, but you don't have some of my, I'm gesturing a lot and you see a little bit as it comes up, but you don't see very much of that. You don't see my body movement. You don't even see other things around me. So there's a limit in terms of the kinds of cues that are attended to. Also, if you mute yourself or if you take yourself off video, you're limiting that even further. What that means then is that we have a greater focus on those cues that are available. And as I mentioned with the environment, we sometimes add additional cues too. So we have less than what would be available to us if we were communicating face to face. Importantly, it can also be interesting to think about this as a sort of performance. That is, we're performing the role of the speaker or the listener as we're engaging in these meetings or conversations or seminars, whatever it is that we're doing. And with that comes certain kinds of sort of rules and beliefs about how we're supposed to do things. So are we supposed to put our makeup on? Are we supposed to get dressed? What should our background be? How should we perform being a listener? How should we engage and show credibility as a speaker? So when we think about nonverbal cues and the ways in which we use them, oftentimes it's useful to think about how we're using them to perform a particular identity, to perform an emotion, to perform a sense of how we are responding to somebody else, and thinking about them that way. And again, we kind of know this, but we are not necessarily always aware of that, is part of the challenge. One of the things, of course, at the moment that's hard with that is that the performances can be exhausting. So just as they can be when we're face to face, this kind of format, especially if we're doing it a lot and we feel like we need to perform a lot, can be very taxing, which I'll talk about in just a moment too. one of the other strange things with this is that we can also see ourselves. So in face-to-face communication, we don't have a sense of how our face is moving. And it can draw our attention sometimes away from interacting with other people and focusing on them. So it adds a sort of new element that we watch ourselves in our own performance, which is not something we typically get to do. Lags can be really challenging too, especially when you're having a meeting and everyone is trying to take their turn at talk. So sometimes, and even when you've had a turn at talk, you could be talking for a while, people can be watching your mouth moving, and then all of a sudden all the noise comes later. All of those make the process of engaging and knowing who's supposed to speak now and how to speak next can be really hard. It's a challenging process even when you're face to face, but we have a lot of nonverbal cues that we show that we're ready to become the speaker. We look at each other for a lot of sort of feedback. We can get some of that online, but, and I'll talk about that in a moment more too, it depends a lot on what the listeners are doing and how much feedback they have, or even if they have their volume on. So that lack of vocal feedback when mute is used is a challenge. And one of my best friends is on the call tonight, and this is something that she's talked about. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about her too. She was in actually an online baby shower, and each person needed to speak about the mom to be. And so she said something that she thought was really funny, but it also could have been taken in different ways, and everyone had their mute on. So she didn't know if they were laughing, which is what she was hoping that they were going to be doing, or they were just not saying anything like, oh my God, I can't believe she said that. Those are two absolute possible interpretations for silence, but we don't know whether it was just the mute or whether it actually fell flat. What a lot of us do when we are on mute is that and Anita, you're wonderful at this, we're really more expressive then to show with our faces that we're really following what the person is saying or laughing a little bit louder. Those would be semblances that we'd be using to show that we're performing the role of listener and giving feedback to the speaker. So those listening cues then can vary a great deal. So in particular, and what I've noticed in online teaching is sort of two different types of listeners. There's the one listener who's super engaged, and I really appreciate as a speaker seeing those different kinds of movements and responses that they do. But that's when people get exhausted. So a number of you had asked about the idea of like, how do I not get so tired? And one of the answers needs to be, to some extent, you have to be a less engaged listener. It's really hard for the speaker, but maybe your performance doesn't have to be quite as good. Again, I hate to say that because it's really beneficial for someone, for the others that are seeing it, but it really is exhausting, especially because of that sort of focus on kind of the closer view that you get about that. So they can vary. We get a lot less feedback back than we normally get. So if everybody's on mute, you don't hear anybody doing their kind of back channels and saying mm-hmm or oh, or showing that it's interesting or showing that they don't understand something. So all of that means that it's an environment that allows for more kinds of nonverbal cues than we sometimes get, but in general actually provides a lot of challenges to our being able to do it well. We're trying to apply some of the things that we do in face-to-face in this online format, and some of that works well and some of it doesn't work as well. The other aspect has to do with changes in face-to-face communication. And I picked this picture just because I thought it was interesting. It showed sort of people interacting more typically, and then people interacting or walking together at this particular moment. So of course, the biggest thing that a lot of people talk about is that during these times of stay at home, we have less interaction, at least except on the online interactions. And we absolutely have less touch. We don't see our friends on the street and give them a hug in the way that we do. Since we're just not interacting as much, we don't get as much of the things that feed us from those interactions. We are also interacting while being masked. And this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for a lot of people, that we rely on people's faces so much to get feedback, to greet one another, to let each other know if we agree with what the other person is saying, what our emotional responses might be. And when we mask a lot of our primary ways in which we get information, a lot of people find it really challenging. I am in a group of 9 women who meets every 2 weeks. We always met face to face. Now we're meeting online. And this came up as a focus of conversation the other day with a couple of people saying, I really don't like going to the grocery store as much as I used to, where I would see people and I would smile at each other, even if we didn't, and just have a moment of interaction and connection, and that it's so much harder with a mask on. Eyes become very important. And so that's a place where some people are putting more effort into making their eyes more expressive, or doing something else with their head nod or something to acknowledge them. But this is some place where you see people respond very differently. I actually appreciate in some ways not having to smile. There's a performative aspect to being human, and especially being a woman, that often means that we're supposed to be pleasant. And so when I see people on the street, there's enough of a cultural norm that I always feel like I need to do some sort of small acknowledgement of them. That's a pretty exhausting process. And so there's a part of me that kind of likes the mask, because it means that I don't feel the need to perform quite as much. So there are benefits and costs to a lot of these things. There's a concept that we talk about called functional ambivalence. And functional ambivalence means that the same thing can have really positive impacts or really negative impacts. And I really feel like this time of COVID-19, we see in nonverbal communication some really wonderful opportunities, but also some really challenging ones, things that engage us and also things that really can deplete us. Interacting at 6 feet. It's something now that we know how to do. This is one of those things where you really see a big change, but it's a really hard thing to do. I was out for a walk, socially distanced, with a friend. We saw another friend who was driving in the driveway close to us. I hadn't seen her in some months. Normally, she would have gotten out of the car. I would have gone over to the car. We would have given each other a hug, but I stayed my 6 feet away. And I felt like I was telling her, you don't matter as much to me, or I'm angry at you. So we had to, I think we knew that it didn't mean that anymore, but my old ways of interpreting that behavior had to be switched in this particular time. Again, this is something that some people like. It gives them a greater sense of safety and a greater sense of autonomy. So people can respond very differently to that, but it's one of the places in which our normal interaction distance had a rule associated with it, and now there's a new rule that most of us are following. There's also something interesting going on right now too, that's related to a relatively new concept called virtue signaling. And virtue signaling is how we use our behavior to show our particular values, and especially being a person of good virtue, of good standing. One of the things I see with masks, either people choosing to wear masks or choosing not to wear masks, is a way to signal their particular value, their particular politics, through that behavior. So some people might wear masks even though they don't feel like they are going to hurt anybody else, or they're going to be harmed themselves, but they might want to just show that I'm wearing this mask to show that I care, to show that I'm a rule follower. Or someone might not wear a mask to say, you know, I don't like these rules. I'm not going to follow these rules. I'm against them. So you can see how the mask itself can become a symbol for signaling a particular value or orientation. There's also an opportunity, though, to anytime we understand that behaviors are rule-oriented, is that we can break them. And so part of why I really like to talk about the fact that even though we don't think about how many different kinds of nonverbal rules we have, how far we're supposed to stand, how we're supposed to sit, what we're supposed to wear, how loud we're supposed to speak, there's a million of them. One of the things is when there are rules, those rules can be broken. And sometimes it's good to break the rules. Sometimes we need to do that because something in our larger society, our larger culture, isn't working very well. So there's you see that at the moment as people are trying to figure out which rules to follow and which ones to break. And then I ask sort of who then gets to have the narrative about what is the right way for us to be acting. And I think in this particular time of seeing the change and also seeing the complexities in our culture and the different ways in which people orient is an opportunity for us to start talking about these behaviors, what they represent, and which of the representations we want to be the primary narrative. Is it about, for example, wearing a mask to care for each other? Or is it about wearing not wearing a mask in order to show our independence and our sense of autonomy? So just a couple of things moving forward, and then we'll open it up for questions. So dealing with and embracing these times. So rather than having particular tips about nonverbal behavior, I'm hoping that these things that I talked about can speak to kind of larger issues that I think are relevant, but thinking about these things too, I hope will also improve your use of the behaviors and your interpretations of those. And one of those is being compassionate with ourselves and others. This is a really, really challenging time in so many different kinds of ways. And the most important thing is to not overreact to what other people are doing, to try to be compassionate with what they might be experiencing. But at the same time, being compassionate with yourself. These are hard decisions that we have to make. It's difficult to be away from interaction if that's something that we really value. And so if you wake up and you're just having a bad day, be compassionate with yourself, because the times are changing, that these are difficult times, and it makes sense that it's not always going to be easy. I also would argue, though, to enjoy solitude. So some of the research that I've done has been specifically about the benefits of solitude. Even though these are scary times, there's so much value that can come when we don't interact quite as much. So it's always interesting for an interpersonal communication scholar to encourage people not to communicate interpersonally maybe quite as much. There's a lot of self-learning, a lot of peace, and a lot of introspection that can come from these periods of solitude. It's not going to last forever. So if you are in a position where you can take advantage of it, think about this time as a short period of time where you're going to be allowed to stay home more, and how do you most want to use that time. I would also say, related to that, is the idea of practicing mindfulness. And your first speaker in the series talked more about mindfulness applied to crisis situations. But if we think about mindfulness as being more present to ourselves and to others, it's easier to be compassionate with ourselves and with others when we do that, because we become more aware of what are the possible things that could be going on for someone else. What are the things that are going on in our own mind that could explain why we are having some of these reactions? So instead of reacting to somebody else's behavior, we might just spend some time like noticing that we have had a strong reaction to somebody, or a positive reaction to somebody, and then ask ourselves, what was that was going on for me that had that kind of strong reaction? So just practicing mindfulness instead of reactivity is really important in these times, especially when we see somebody else engaging nonverbally in a way that we find problematic. And interestingly, I actually studied, in some ways, talk more than I study nonverbal communication, because I'm really interested in the interpretations that people make about nonverbal behavior. So the best thing to do is, especially if it's with your partner or somebody that you're close to, one of your work colleagues, if something seems strange and you're having some sort of reaction to them, and you've tried to sort of figure it out on your own with compassion, actually talking about interpretations and reactions is really important. So saying, you know, I noticed that you are not contacting me as much, and I was sort of interpreting that as maybe you're mad at me. Are you? Or is there something going on? So actually trying to be vulnerable and bring some of those kinds of issues up, or to say, this is how I interpreted this behavior, or this is what I meant by my behavior. So I just stayed 6 feet away from you, and it's because I care about you. If you go for walks, oftentimes if you have someone else walking on the same side of the street, you're going to walk over to the other side of the street. Normally we would do that in the old rules only when we wanted to be away from that person for some reason. Now we do it as a form of care for that person, and most of the time we know that. But sometimes I'll yell, I'm only moving away from you just to social distance, so that they know about that. I do want to say an interesting thing. One of my students in my nonverbal class this quarter for an assignment talked about that. And he talked about being out running and how he would move across the street, or the other person would. And he said, now he actually interprets it in a way that's not difficult. But he is a Hispanic man, and he said oftentimes people will walk across the street when they see him coming. And that's a very different kind of interpretation and reaction that that he has for that. So actually, the new rules are much more benign. When we walk away from someone, it usually has a more negative aspect to it. And finally, one of the things when we look more at our nonverbal behavior and how we're responding to things, it gives us this incredible opportunity to learn what it is that we value, that's embedded in that particular behavior. Like I really miss hugs, and it really helps me to be even more aware, even as an introvert, about how much I care about the people that I'm close to and how good it feels to connect to someone like that. But there's also an important opportunity to, as I mentioned earlier, to say, what is changing that we don't want to come back? What do we want to give up? What isn't changing that we still want to change now that we know that these things are changeable? So that is what my sort of the main lessons and main things I really wanted to get a chance to talk to you about. I thank you for your participation, and I give you this picture to remind you that one day we will all be back at a table again and get a chance to see one another.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I appreciate that. Actually, and I also appreciate that you've brought pizza in as we move towards the dinner hour. So thank you for that. So grateful for those words. I want to just make a quick announcement along with a continued invitation for questions. I was struck, Valerie, as you were talking, that we could also invite folks who just also want to share about their experiences. I think more so than maybe some of the previous talks, there's something deeply personal about what you're discussing, and you've brought forward some wonderful anecdotes of your own and one from your friend. And so if folks are having a little bit of a harder time formulating a question, we absolutely will invite, if folks want to unmute themselves and share. I think that this format would very much lend itself, and this topic lends itself, if you're comfortable with that, Valerie.
Right, absolutely. One of the things I try to teach in my classes about the consequences, the consequentiality of nonverbal behavior, that the cues that we use with each other are some of the most important humanizing things that we can do. We show someone else that we love them, that we care for them through our behaviors. We reflect our own identity. So there's so much that we do that's humanizing through our nonverbal cues, but there's a lot that's dehumanizing as well. So when we see someone and we stereotype them, we are using their physical nonverbal cues, their appearance, to do that. So there are some things that we do that are horrifically dehumanizing as well. So I'm not a person who says, yeah, we need more of this. That's why I talk about the complexity, because it has that functional ambivalence again. It can show our identity to others. That can be really important. But depending on how they view our particular identity, for example, that can affect how they engage with us as well. So yeah, I would imagine that everybody here has both positive and negative experiences with things related to nonverbal cues.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will start with some questions for you, and I do encourage folks to propagate the chat, or also just be thinking as we move in a couple of minutes to opening up to the full collection, because one of my favorite parts of these talks is when we do involve the audience and there's such a brain trust in the room. But Valerie, I'm struck by so much of what you shared. And one thing that I wanted to follow up on a little bit is, I loved how you described how there both are costs and benefits. And you gave a great example of, personally for you, there's something that's, it's a little bit easier not to feel like you've got to do that performative smile with strangers on the street. And that's an example of a benefit of nonverbal communication that happens when you're outside of the home. I'm thinking about an example and wanted to ask you, in these computer-mediated environments where we have a reduced amount of nonverbal cues, I want to talk about some additional maybe possible benefits that we could see as the assets of this computer-mediated environment, whether it's Google Teams, Hangouts, or Microsoft Teams. I can't believe I said that. If there's anyone on the call that's Microsoft, they'll have my head. Microsoft Teams, Google Hangouts, Zoom. I'm just going to say that I've noticed, because I don't choose to turn off my computer, that I have a better sense of what my resting face can look like. And I realize that without a computer-mediated experience, it's making me think about, well, what do I look like in a staff meeting? What do I look like in a faculty meeting? What are my facial cues? And I feel as if there's a muscle memory that I'm developing because I'm looking at myself in different ways. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about either ideas you have on what are some benefits of what we might be experiencing, because there are so many things that are costs, for sure, about this computer-mediated environment. But does that example that I'm giving strike a chord with you? Are there other things you can think of that we could see as positives for this computer-mediated environment?
I actually think what you just said is a really good one, that we'd never really get to see how we look to others.
Yeah.
And it gives us a chance, like, am I doing what I want to as a co-interactant with that person? So I think that that was a really important part of it. I will say, just sort of as a negative, in this same group that I mentioned earlier, someone talked about how they hate seeing themselves so much on the screen that it's actually created sort of a depression for them. So people respond really differently to that. But I think if you look at it as an opportunity to say, am I being the kind of interactant that I want to be to others, you can get a better sense of that because you actually get a chance to look at it. Like right now, I'm looking up at the little pictures, so I don't have to see myself on the big screen, because that's a little bit too. And Nessa, there's two of me, so that's particularly weird. But anyway, but I would say that one of the biggest benefits is that this kind of communication now is becoming normative. So before, we've certainly had FaceTime for a long time, we had Skype, but now people are realizing that they can actually have interactions that are a form of face-to-face interaction with people that are very far from them. And so I know a number of people who are now interacting with some regularity with people that live 1,000 miles from them. And so they have just, oh, I never thought I could actually be with you. We've had dinner together with friends. We played games with friends, things like that, that are things that you can do even with people that are not close anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's one of the positive things too. Going back to Skype, when my husband and I were dating, he was living in California and I was living up here, and we Skyped together for 2 hours every night. Mm-hmm. And he really, when he moved up here and we got married, he really missed it because we were focused on just each other, and really looking sort of right into each other's eyes. There were no sort of distractions. And that actually was a really sort of intimate, very humanizing thing. So it's harder with the bigger groups, but certainly when you can do one-on-ones with people in this way, that normally you wouldn't have a chance to interact with, you might call them on the phone or you might not interact at all. It gives you not only the chance to interact, but the real chance to sort of be right there with them. So I would say that those are some of the positives to it.
Yeah, I know. I talked to a dear aunt of mine who appreciates the visual cues in a way that when she would join group phone calls, very hard for her to follow the thread because it was entirely an auditory experience. But there's something about being, like you said, being able to hone in and say, this is the person who's talking, that you can follow it in a different way. And we learn, and all of us learn in different ways. And so the affordances can be different for different people. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to just draw on that excellent point you made at the end about this is an opportunity for greater verbal clarity with one another in the absence of certain nonverbal opportunities. And your example of being able to speak in a frank way, in a really candid way with people that perhaps are close to us, but I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about, do you have examples or ideas for how we navigate that, perhaps more in a professional environment where it's one thing to be able to convey to our nearest and dearest how we're feeling and to utilize the opportunity to vocalize. Would love to hear you talk a little bit more, because you started to give me some ideas about what might we do to, I'm thinking of a staff meeting environment where there would be almost an invitation for a greater level of communicative practice because the nonverbal cues are more challenging in a computer-mediated environment.
I would say sort of two related things. Most of us don't like when someone approaches us like, you did this wrong, or the problem with you is. So generally, sort of avoid that. But there's two different things that could work to kind of separate that, so someone might hear it better. Mm-hmm. So the first thing you might say is something about using this moment. So, this is such an unusual time, and I'm really realizing that there are some communication challenges around this. And so you contextualize it within that time, and then if you mention what you observed them doing, that would be, it's easier then for them to be able to come back to it and just say, oh, you're just asking for information around all this ambiguity. Mm-hmm. The other part, of course, and this is really common, is to say, rather than you looked at me this way, to say, you had a facial expression that I interpreted this way.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what, was there something going on for you? So to first take ownership that the interpretation is yours and not that you know the meaning. So that's where that becomes really important. Like, you looked at me, in a disrespectful way. You could say you had an expression on yourself, that on your face, that I interpreted as disrespectful. Mm-hmm. And then it's easier for them to say, well, yeah, I was disrespecting you. I didn't like what you were saying, or which is important. I mean, that may be what they say. Or, gosh, I didn't even know that. I realized as you were saying that I had been thinking about something at home, and my expression was really just not related to you at all, and I apologize. So it gives an opportunity. So the biggest thing is not to tell somebody else what they meant by their behavior, but rather contextualize and realize that it's your interpretation, that you're asking them a question about, that you're being curious about.
Yeah. And then along with that confirmation and opening up that dialogue, we can also all individually take opportunities to be clear at the onset of conversations how we're doing. And so know that it's an opportunity for us to more readily vocalize that sets a context that would be harder to discern, whether it's from 6 feet or whether it's via a screen. So I like, you're gonna have me thinking about that a lot, not only the way in which I might create overtures with individuals where I'm seeking for some kind of clarification, or also the way that I'm going to create opportunities for myself to share how am I feeling today, so that there's less, or there's more context, so there can be fewer opportunities for things to be misconstrued. Because I think as humans, we tend to, it's very easy to make up worlds in our heads, and I think that becomes even more habitual in this time where we have fewer clues to go by.
I would just sort of add one little caveat to that too, that they may have exactly been doing what we thought that they were doing, and they might say, I wasn't doing that. And it may be because they're not aware that they were doing that or were feeling that, or they may just not actually. So one of the things about nonverbal communication is it's very deniable. So you could say, oh no, that wasn't what I was intending, when you really were. And we certainly see a lot of cases of this. I think often of when during the last election, last presidential election, and Chris Christie had been running and was not running anymore, and was on stage with Donald Trump when he was the likely nominee, and he was standing there sort of like this. And so the media went all over that and looking and saying, Christie sold his soul, or he looked like he wants to be anywhere else but there. And he responded and said, how else am I supposed to stand? I'm just standing here listening. So he denied that, and it may have been actual, or he may have just said no, because again, the same cues can mean different kinds of things, and so there is a deniability. So you don't necessarily know whether you're getting to the actual answer, but you still have to go with what somebody else is willing to tell you or knows about themselves.
Absolutely. Good. At this point, I definitely want to include others. Hey, I think Relina, I saw you put a question. Would you like to ask that, or do you want to unmute? And I'd love for you to join.
Sure, yeah. Hello. Hi,
Welcome.
Valerie. Hi.
Hey, Anita.
Hey, Anita. Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I mean, I put my question here in the chat. But so we've been doing these dialogues as part of interrupting privilege, and one of the things people have been talking about is this translation from microaggressions to from a real life, from a space to the online space, and in particular, people saying, well, in a face-to-face space, I'm able to insert myself in certain ways to make sure that I can be heard. Right. And there are all kinds of different interpersonal tricks that I can do to make myself just be visible. And I can't use those same types of tricks in video conferencing. And I'm being ignored more. My voice isn't being heard. I'm being dismissed. People are calling on my male colleagues, my white colleagues, far more than I was experiencing in these face-to-face meetings. And I don't know what advice to give people, because I mean, what do? You interrupt somebody? It's not, even as an ally, thinking about that process of amplification feels super different in this medium. So I'm wondering what you might say, or what type of advice you might have for folks.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a challenging one, whether face-to-face or not. So I know, for example, some people, when they want to signal that they want to start talking, will sit forward more and really make it very obvious. And in this context, you need to do that perhaps more. That doesn't mean that it's going to be noticed. And part of that, it depends on the particular configuration that's going on at a particular time. So if you have the main screen, like right now with one person, the other ones are so small that they might not get picked up on as much. And so the people who are more likely to just start talking are the ones who are going to get that opportunity more. So part of it absolutely is the technology makes that even more challenging. And especially for people who are less likely to have very exaggerated behaviors that would kind of get that attention. One thing I would think, though, is that in something like Zoom, where you can raise your hand, I mean, that like you can technically, you have the little thing where you can raise your hand, and especially if there's a moderator, is to talk to somebody before the meeting and say it would be really good to be able to have to only have people be able to do this by raising their hand, and I'm going to watch the order in which they raise their hand, and you speak when you get called on because of the order that you're in. There's a way to sort of, that makes it more egalitarian, and it creates a norm of non-interruption. So that would be another way of doing it as well. One thing I wanted to mention too, about whether it's microaggressions or something larger, like a symbol like a Confederate flag, that issue about polysemy is really important. So people might say something like, well, I didn't intend to be to do a microaggression. I was just being myself. Importantly, one can say that you may absolutely have been not intending to do that, but that kind of behavior can be interpreted that way legitimately, just like your interpretation for what you were doing could be a completely legitimate interpretation. But it's important to realize that other people might be making those interpretations. So that idea of polysemy and normalizing these different interpretations, I think is really helpful. And so you are certainly welcome to keep doing what you're doing, but you need to understand that people can legitimately be seeing that behavior in this way, regardless of your intent. So that's a different aspect of your question. But I guess I would say that is, if there's an opportunity to speak to the person who's monitoring the meeting ahead of time, and especially if it's a group that you meet with often, to create these rules that don't benefit the people who are the most likely to speak out.
Mm. It makes me wonder, thanks so much for that question, Relina. And I turn this out to the full group. It makes me wonder if there are some best practices that are being developed, some guides, some online links, and it doesn't have to be shared this evening, but I certainly would welcome, as I think as we continue to exist within this environment, we're going to see, I hope, the proliferation of best practices for creating more egalitarian, more participatory, more equitable engagement in these environments. I'm sure some of these already exist, but it's going to be interesting and I think really vital to see it happen, so that there's more intentionality put into the way in which a meeting unfolds, which we should be bringing to all meetings and we should be bringing to all engagements, but I think it becomes even more crucial when certain advantages get exaggerated in a computer-mediated environment. So
I do think like with the hand raising thing, in a meeting I was in the other day, it would raise your hand, but then it would just be marked next to your name, and your names are in alphabetical order. So it didn't put in order whose hand was raised first necessarily.
I see.
Another way to say is, if you want to speak, put your name in chat, and then it's easier to figure out who said it first, because sometimes you end up skipping somebody who put their hand up, and then they feel also that they're not seen. So that technology, if they could do some sort of chronological order and not alphabetical order for that, or doing something in chat that has a chronological order, those are ways in which you do it. But again, sort of saying the rules out loud at the beginning as well, to say this is how we're going to be doing that, and even to say why we're doing it that way, that can help you express the importance of those values and set the standards for that for the meeting.
Absolutely. Juan, would you like to ask your question of Valerie?
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
So, yeah, well, basically were you talking about this protocol or best practices to have, and mostly if you are like a company and you want your team that are like in the front line talking to customers, how would you like create this in a sense that all the values of the company are also on video with this new kind of interaction? That would be like my first question. And the second question is like, we have all these privacy data also in the conversation like a couple of years ago of how many information we are sending to on the internet. And now we have all these video turned on. And as you mentioned, like now companies can record like what is our background, what are the things that we have on our house, and how they can like start doing all these AI or evaluate or analyze the information on your ambient, and then they can like start to influence you because they know more about you and what used to be like your privacy.
So I didn't fully understand the first question, so I want you to come back to that in a moment, but I will answer the second one. And your point is really good. I know a number of people like Evelyn who would have their, Zoom allows you to have a different kind of background. One of my colleagues has a background that's from a wonderful company, a furniture company. So everyone thinks she has this particular living room, which isn't actually hers. So she still has sort of the same space, but students of mine have said specifically that they, although I encourage them to be, as Anita did before, to show their faces because it's easier for engagement, I always say that they don't need to, because some of them say it really feels like a violation of privacy to do that. And so I never would force them into that. But I do think that is somewhat, so that's something that needs to be negotiated. And if you are required to have yourself in there, to take advantage of those backgrounds, and so you wouldn't have that particular part of it. That may not be a very satisfactory answer, but those are the two things I can think of. One is realizing that people do have privacy concerns and respect those. And then if you have to be on the screen, my husband does some meetings weekly online, and he just put a big sheet up on his wall because he just didn't want any, even small things. There wasn't even much behind him, but he just didn't want any of those showing. So he just created the screen. That's how the sheet, and that's how he leaves his office for that particular reason too. So that tends to be something that that you have to make the choices about, but they're good to be thinking about, and it's useful to talk to other people about them and say, do you really want people to know that you have a giraffe in the back? So one more, can you rephrase your first question for me?
Yeah, sure. Like, so if you connect it to what you just said, I was saying like, for example, a company, for example, the UW can say like, hey, Valerie, now when you have a Zoom meeting, you should have this background and you should act like this because you are talking as a UW person, not as Valerie when you are with your friends. So what happened then? Like what companies should do about that?
I might leave that for some of the rest of you because I don't know that environment as well. I know that probably I would have a pretty strong reaction to that and not necessarily like that very much. I know there are a couple of professors who have required their students not only to be on the screens, but also to dress in a certain kind of way and even to shower ahead of classes.
At the U?
Yeah. And And I think that they were doing that in the showering part in part is actually a care move to say, like, I really want to make sure you're taking care of yourselves and showering. But the other part of it was also sort of a sense of it's like you're in a classroom, and so you should be acting like you're in a classroom. And the students in general didn't like being told what they should do, and understandably so. So there may be some opportunity for some pushback to that. But I would love to hear what other people have to say about that, because I can imagine different kinds of reactions.
Yeah. I mean, Juana, you raised such a good question about as we're already living in a more blurred professional and personal world, even before COVID. And I think technology accelerated much of that, but COVID has brought forward some unique challenges when it comes to that question of, you may be in your home, but you're on a professional call, or you are acting on behalf of your professional affiliation. And to what extent can a company or an institution ask of you certain performative qualities, whether it's a backdrop or things like that. And I appreciate how your questions we think of privacy at the CommLead program often through the lens of data. And this is data. I mean, you're getting data on me too. And it'll be fascinating to see what in the long term is done with that data, because we're getting visuals that we've never had before to the same degree. So it's such good questions. And I do turn it out, as Valerie did, if there are folks that want to either comment on that. Do they have experience with that? Have you had professional conversations around the way in which you present yourself at this time from your home on behalf of where you work? Is that something that people have experience with on this call? Be curious to see if there's anyone that has experienced that.
Anita,
oh yes, Rach, go ahead.
I've worked from home. I work remotely for a company that's based in Boston, and I've worked remotely for years, and have always tried to make sure that however I present myself is of a certain kind, because people do judge you by all of those things that you're talking about. But now that everyone's at home, I see everybody scrambling to figure out, am I going to have like a green screen behind me? I worked with ESL instructors who feel like some of their very rich students, they're embarrassed to show how they're living in some cases. And so just the dynamics of all of those classroom environments, it's very complicated. And I think it's interesting to be talking about this and linking it to what Valerie was talking about the rules, right? And how the rules are changing and how we have to define the rules as we go. And that's something that I'm very interested to see how some of those things become more spoken and more defined, because just as Valerie was talking about the masks, I mean, I have a friend who said very specifically to me, this means that I care about you. We're doing this because we care about people. See them? Drives me crazy. They're not wearing a mask. They don't care about us. But all of those things, like actually needing to verbalize those rules just seems so important right now, because it feels like there's so much chaos. So it's just interesting also about how those rules maybe become more defined and as things go along and we continue to be in these environments.
Have you, and people can raise their hands if they'd like, if there's something they'd like to say. Rachel, have you seen, because you have worked at a distance for years, have you seen different norms changing has your distributed team been very similar? Have there been shifts for them? Like, was the Boston office now solidly distributed? Are there changes in the way that you engage with your team?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing is that the people who have worked remotely for a long time always come dressed in a certain way with certain background around them. The people who have suddenly scrambled and have been sent home, someone was telling me, yeah, I love this. I never have to put on regular clothes, do my hair. And I'm like, I really think you should, part of me is like, we are professionals right now. Like, what messages are you then putting out, and are you aware of them? I mean, we had one person in a meeting who was like this, the whole time. I took a picture. I had to take a screenshot. It was like, here's a very clear message that she's sending about how she's feeling about this communication. And we struggle with our students too, with some kind of etiquette about how the camera looks at you. Like, if you're like that, I can't hear you, especially if you're learning English, you need to be able to be speaking towards the screen and the camera.
Yes.
So I think it definitely, people are struggling with it, is what I think. I think those people who already have a setup and they're comfortable and they know where they're going to be every time, it's easier. But when you're now thrown into a household or a place where you don't really have anything you want to show behind you, or you're with lots of other people who are also competing for space, and now you're like in the corner of your basement, it becomes very, very tricky, I think, for people. And there has to be a lot more flexibility on how we judge people based on those things and how we determine how we're going to present ourselves. So it's just very interesting.
There's a couple of things with that I want to follow up on. One is I do think that technology, one advancement could be to, I know that Zoom's already kind of moved quickly into being able to have the virtual backgrounds without having to have a blank behind you. So thinking about how can the technology just focus on the face and blur everything else, be an automatically more sort of equalizing thing to do. But Rachel, your points were really interesting. And one of the things, when I talk about the values that are underneath our nonverbal cues and the interpretations that we make, is that the rules that you are sort of saying that this is how we're in a professional environment, and so we ought to be dressing in professional ways or sitting in the right way. In those moments when you're saying that is a really good opportunity to talk directly about the values. So not just like, it's a workplace, we need to do this, but this is why, because it shows that nobody has to do any of those things. These are things that we've developed, but they're developed for reasons. So to talk about what those reasons are, and when you're doing that and talking about the values and the beliefs and the assumptions underneath them, there's also more room for negotiation and conversation about, do we want it to be that way, or do we want it to be different than that? So there's just when you identify those rules and the reactions that we have to them, is the perfect place for going deeper.
Mm-hmm. So we have 2 more questions, and then we'll move to the after party. Claudia, do you want to pose yours, and then we'll close with yours, Susan?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Valerie, for this. The question I wrote in the comment is, if you could just elaborate a bit more on your earlier comments about the dynamic of how gender socialization affects how we're adapting to these kind of new COVID behaviors. You use your own example of being masked as kind of a little bit of a relief, because there's not this sort of impulse to need to kind of check in with whoever you might be seeing. And the question I just have is, if you could elaborate, are there other kinds of gendered aspects that you're noticing, or other kinds of spaces that are showing up along the kind of gendered norms where men and women and other genders might be just responding differently as a result of that socialization background in this new context of, I only see half your face.
Claudia, that is such a great question, and I am going to actually pay more attention to that now than I have. The main things that I think about have to do with these norms of pleasantness, and this particularly smiling. I show a video to my class often that's about, and it asks them, and then I also ask them how many of them have been told that they ought to smile more. And some of the guys will raise their hand, but all of the women raise their hands. And that's in and of itself a really, really big moment, to look at the extent to which people, that looking pleasant, looking friendly, smiling is such a strong expectation of performing female in our larger culture. That doesn't mean, of course, everybody does it. People push back at it. There's lots of different aspects to it, but it's really strong, and you find out a lot about it based on what people tell you ought to do more. So I can imagine it's other things that people might say as well, like, oh gosh, you must be glad to be home with your children a lot more, as a very gendered kind of statement to make. I really need to think on this one some more. It's such an important kind of question, but those are the only things that this time of my energy that I'm coming up with. But there is so much more too.
I'm even thinking of the article
Thank you.
on Nancy Pelosi's various masks, and the idea of matching her outfit to the mask. I mean, that's to me a classic kind of article that would probably never be written about a man. And maybe Nancy Pelosi loves choosing her masks and having it match, and who knows? But I am struck by that. Susan, your last question.
Yeah, I was just curious if you have noticed any difference between introverts and extroverts when it comes to using like Zoom or any other virtual platform. Like, I'm an introvert and I seem to excel at this because it's all mostly me having a conversation with one other person, and it doesn't matter how many other people are here. Like this is fine for me, as opposed to if I were in a room with 40 other people, I would not necessarily be speaking up right now.
That's a lot of people have talked about that this is sort of a time for introverts. My son is an introvert, and he's 21, and he said, I've been social distancing for 21 years. I finally found my moment. So for some people, it really, the time itself really works. I think that there's going to be differences with Zoom because you still have to engage a lot, and because you're seeing yourself and there's the performance, it still can be really exhausting. However, the moment that you turn it off or you turn your screen off, you can go and you can sort of go to your backstage, sort of using Irving Goffman's term, this is your front stage. You can go to your backstage and in a way that you can't just withdraw from a normal interaction. Mm-hmm. So you can have your period and then you can have your down period a lot easier in this, unless you have meetings completely throughout the day. Most people that I know who are extroverts find that Zoom is okay, but because extroverts get their energy from being around other people, it's such a difficult time to be around so few people. So even if they're on here, you're not getting that same amount of energy that you get from feeding off of people. So I think in general, this time benefits introverts more than it benefits extroverts, which is really good because our society absolutely benefits extroverts. We prefer extroverts. We like people who are outgoing and friendly, and the ones that are shyer, we have more negative views about. So I'm glad to give introverts some time, but even then, sort of understanding that I don't think Zoom is, for very many people, anything but exhausting. Ultimately, it has some really good aspects to it, but if you like interaction, you want to be in the interaction. If you don't, and you have to do the performing, it's still really a tiring thing. But like you said, there are some benefits to that because and especially if it's a smaller group. And there's really something wonderful about the Brady Bunch thing. I feel very groupness in those moments as well.
Thank you.
I added in the chat box, as you were talking, Valerie, a short article that I encountered a couple weeks ago by Adam Grant, talking about introverts, extroverts in the time of COVID, but also then he had some very interesting things to say about solitude, which you mentioned in your talk. So I thought people might be interested in reading what he has to say. So I dropped that into the chat. At this point, I'm going to give you back the screen, Valerie, just for your call to action. And then I've got a couple announcements, and then we'll just have a nice chance to greet you and thank you. Almost a virtual, like walking up to the podium saying hello, thanking you for your talk. But at this point, I'd love to have you close with your call to action.
Sure, and this is somewhat similar to what I had talked about before, but I think that compassion is the word that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds, and for ourselves and for others. And with that, giving people the benefit of the doubt. So if somebody is acting in a way that we really think is problematic, give them the benefit of the doubt. That doesn't mean that you can't explore it and find out more, but to understand that we don't necessarily know what their lived experience is. Certainly if it's having an effect on us, it's really important for us to talk about it. But I did find myself driving along the waterfront the other day and saw about 1,000 people and 4 masks. And I found myself sort of like getting mad and wanting to yell out the window. And I said, this is somewhat about me. It's not about them. And for me just to sort of yell that way, I'm going to just be compassionate. They know what they're doing. They're making their choices, and I don't need to engage with them. Anyway, that's a little bit more than you needed to know. But I would say that the biggest thing is that to understand that we are playing a role in our own meaning making and our own reactions. So giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt, giving the other person the benefit of the doubt too, and talking to each other more.
Yes. No, I thank you for taking us through that that thought process, because I think it's very human, and it's something that many of us have experienced, I'm sure, in different ways in different environments over the last couple months. So thank you for that call to action. Thank you so much, Valerie, for sharing your wisdom with us. A round of applause for Valerie's talk. I appreciate it. And just a couple announcements here to close, most of which are in gratitude. This is a time for being grateful for things, and I'm grateful to many people to make this possible. Valerie, you're number one for coming and sharing with us. But I'd also love to do a shout out to the 5 students that are part of that comprise the COVID Consultancy. We have Stacy Stewart, Ryan Quigtar, Susan McLaren, who asked our final question, Meg Herndon, and especially Evelyn Kuo, who was very active, and her role within the consultancy is these events, and so has been working tirelessly in terms of the event management. So Evelyn, thank you so much. I also want to thank comm lead student Roger Cottle, who's been doing the work on thought exchange. So that was really helpful for me and for Valerie in anticipating some of the questions that might be shared tonight. So happy to have Roger working on that. I also really want to do a shout out for Mo Herbert, who is the multimedia tutor and comm lead student who was really instrumental in making sure that all the back end things happened tonight and helping facilitate in the chat. So Mo, thank you very much for that. I want to thank my colleague, Alex Stonehill, who is our head of creative strategy at CommLead and very much involved in working deliberately with the COVID Consultancy to help them in the way that they ideate and work towards the mission of that consultancy. So thank you, Alex, for that. As has been the case with the other talks, we're going to be sending out a survey, a follow-up synopsis of tonight. We've also dropped the survey into the chat box. Thank you very much. So that if you want to take a look at it right now and not wait for that email, you may. But that will be coming forward along with the recording for tonight. So that will be in your inboxes shortly. I also wanted to do a little PSA that for folks that may be joining next week, and maybe you've been getting announcements like this from where you work or other institutions, but do upgrade to Zoom 5.0. I believe that there's a pretty fundamental shift happening. Another link has, I think, been dropped into the chat box about updating to Zoom 5.0 to make sure you'll be able to join next week. And if this is the kind of conversation that appeals to you, if you want to learn more about CommLead, please visit our website. We'd be happy to talk to you more, whether you're a potential student, a potential speaker, a member of our community that wants to learn more. We welcome that engagement. Thank you very much. Next week at 5:30, we have our final conversation. Claudia is the second to last person that asked a question, so I want to give her a shout out. So excited that Claudia will be joining, Claudia Chang. She's going to present a talk titled Working as a Distributed Team During COVID-19. And for the CommLead community, as an affiliate instructor, Claudia actually built our first class on distributed teams and leadership around distributed teams. So it's going to be so wonderful to have Claudia in conversation around what it's like to manage across time zones, across technologies, and I think it's a perfect segue from your talk, Valerie, too. So the chronology works so well. So Claudia, thrilled that you're going to be with us next week, 5:30, and I will be helping moderate that conversation as well.